This week on Dialogue, Japan's nuclear nightmare. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Now I'd like to introduce you to this week's guests. Robert Hathaway is director of the Wilson Center's Asia program. Bob served for 12 years on the staff for the Foreign Affairs Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. Robert Litwak is the center's vice president for programs and director of international security studies. A former director of non-proliferation for the National Security Council, Rob is also a consultant to the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Nobuo Fukuda is the Japan scholar at the Wilson Center. Nobuo is a journalist with more than 25 years of experience with the Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun. Gentlemen, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Nice to be with you.
Nobuo, I'd like to begin with talking about the human toll before we dive too heavily into the technicalities of what's happening in the nuclear disaster. Your prime minister, among others, has called this the worst disaster to hit Japan since World War II. Give us some context for that. It's a dramatic statement, but what does it mean?
Yes, it's been nearly 3 weeks since the earthquake of a magnitude 9.0 and the huge tsunami hit the northeast coast of Japan. And as to 31st of March, I mean, the deaths is almost 12,000. And another 16,000 people have been missing. So I think our Prime Minister, Mr. Khan, has been right in saying that that was the worst national disaster Japan has experienced since the end of the World War II.
And talk a bit about what you know from correspondence and phone calls and communication with people back in Japan. How are people dealing?
Well, initially what we heard and read a lot was kind of commendation of the well-preparedness of the Japanese people against natural disasters. I would say we're certainly used to, living with earthquakes and sometimes tsunamis. But, for the past few weeks, I think, that kind of, was kind of resided, subsided, and I think people started discussing the, kind of human factors which contributed to the disaster. For example, at the troubled, nuclear power plant, Fukushima Daiichi, it's been found that the water pump, which is a crucial part of the backup system, needed to cool down the nuclear reactor, was swept away by the tsunami because it was located outside the building of the nuclear power plant, facing the ocean. And also the workers at the site kind of failed to fill up the nuclear reactors immediately after the earthquake hit. That's what they were supposed to do because all the power was lost. But they didn't do it, fearing, the pumping in the water would damage the boilers, situated right next to the reactors. If they did them, if they filled the nuclear reactors with the fresh water, then, the partial meltdowns, which are taking place now of the reactors, might have been avoided. People started talking about it. And actually there were 4 nuclear power plants which were directly hit by the tsunamis on that day, March 11th. But actually other 3 nuclear power plants kind of stayed intact and successfully cooled down nuclear reactors and kept the reactors kind of cool since then. So, it's been kind of pointed out that the disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi might have been caused by human errors, complacency, and arrogance, maybe.
Bob, observers of the region like yourself, this so-called Pacific Ring of Fire, how much is concern, with hindsight now, of course we can say there should be significant concern, but how much concern really was there in anticipation of the possibility of an event like this?
Well, the Japanese, over a period of decades, had really earned the reputation as being the nation perhaps most prepared to meet this type of catastrophe. And as we know now, even the best of preparation, which is not to say Japan always had practiced the best of preparation, but even the best of preparation probably is going to be inadequate against a catastrophe of this magnitude. For me, as someone who lives in the United States, I'm immediately prompted to ask, is the United States prepared? Were we to face a similar catastrophe of this magnitude, not simply an earthquake or other natural disaster, but a nationwide cyber breakdown, for instance, or a SARS-like pandemic? Are we prepared to cope with a truly catastrophic event? And if not, shouldn't we be thinking about this and planning for this at this stage? Having said that, undoubtedly Japanese preparations prior to March the 11th saved many, many lives.
Well, even things like building codes, some of the strictest on the planet, when we think back to what happened in Haiti, a relatively primitive infrastructure compared to what Japan has built. And yet, how much can you prepare for something that's almost off the scales, 9.0 on the Richter scale? I think the nuclear plant in Japan was designed to withstand a 6.5 earthquake. And here we're dealing with 9.0. Rob, in terms of the industry, the nuclear industry, how far can you go in creating safety nets against some natural disaster of this size and scope?
What's extraordinary is that a 9.0 is almost off the scale, and yet the reactor survived intact, relatively intact. It was the tsunami that put the facility out of operation and stopped the pumps to maintain the stable temperature of the nuclear reactor and the cooling ponds. The current debate about nuclear energy will now play out against the backdrop of events in Japan. There is now a conjunction of events. On the one hand, on the macro level, a broad recognition that nuclear energy is going to will be an increasing part of our energy mix, both for energy security reasons, because oil products come out of a volatile region, but also for reasons of climate change and attempting to lower our collective carbon footprint in the biosphere. There are alternatives, exotics, renewables, and they should be part of the mix, but they can't be ramped up to a magnitude, scaled up, so to speak, to really give us significant leverage on reducing the carbon footprint. So nuclear will have to be part of that mix. And I think that the Japan nuclear crisis raises the question of how a nuclear renaissance, a term that's used widely, can unfold in a manner that takes into account safety requirements as well as nuclear non-proliferation requirements.
And is there some thought perhaps that maybe there are some geographic regions that don't lend themselves to nuclear power?
I imagine that the geologists are looking at the seismic charts, and certainly that should be taken into account as a factor. I know in the United States, in California, which is along known fault lines, whether existing reactors need to be upgraded, hardened, is being addressed. But I think what the Japan case highlights is that here you have a country that really is viewed internationally as a leader on construction and safety. And an extraordinary event occurred with the unfolding crisis. But I think it raises the question about how other countries, and some 50 countries are exploring how they will increase nuclear energy, how that new wave of construction that will take place, how it will be completed. In the case of the Japanese reactors, they were decades old, I believe almost 40 years in some cases, and the government had kept relicensing them. And I think now we have to look at old reactors that would never be given a license now, and whether they can continue to be licensed. I think the issue is particularly germane to China and India, whose reactor designs go back some 25 years, and whether those designs are going to be adequate for this anticipated wave of construction.
Nobuo, what is the reliance in Japan on this particular nuclear facility for energy? How important is it in the overall scheme of things?
Well, actually, the 30% approximately
30% of the nation's
electricity produced comes from nuclear power plants.
Oh, not the Fukushima plant in particular.
Fukushima power plants are particularly, it's one of the biggest, I think, nuclear power plants. It has 6 nuclear reactors. I'm sorry, I don't keep the exact power they produce, but it's one of the major supplier of energy to the capital Tokyo and its industrial vicinities.
What you, in a piece that you wrote, you raised some questions about the fact that here's a reactor that's as far away as it is from Tokyo, but it's the choice, it's the site chosen for such a potentially dangerous facility, and yet the city 50 more miles away.
Well, actually, the nuclear site is more than 150 miles away from Tokyo.
Right, 150 miles away. Yes. Thank you. So you raised some questions in your piece about whether this is appropriate, that some people who live that far away live in the shadow of the cooling towers and the potential risks, while the energy benefits are...
Well, I could maybe point out some historical factors. I mean, where actually the nuclear power plants were, definitely unwanted and dangerous facilities, for the most of the Japanese public, and especially with the, kind of the traumatized memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think, we witnessed, kind of fierce anti-nuclear power plant movements, especially in 1960s and 70s. But the government was pretty much determined to press on, and they pushed for the project, sometimes with the some incentives, mostly financial, and the site where Fukushima reactors are located, I would say, well, it's a kind of a relatively less wealthy area in Japan.
Elderly population?
Yes, the populations are more aging, and there are less industries, less employment, and what the government offered was nuclear subsidies to be provided to the communities surrounding the nuclear sites, and also compensations for the fishermen. And I think the communities reluctantly agreed to accept those facilities. That was some 40, 50 years ago. And that's how, the energy source for Tokyo and its suburbs has been located such far away from the places.
Rob, could you shed some light on, when we talk about radioactivity, it brings out all kinds of primal responses. Japan clearly has a particular historical reaction to the fear of nuclear radiation. Could you, in some ways, give us a sense of how much of that is an unreasonable fear and how much the fear is reasonable, what we should be expecting as this drama unfolds as far as the impact of radioactivity and its spread?
Well, it remains to be seen, and we've gotten some information from Japanese authority on the situation at these reactors, and whether there's a meltdown or partial meltdown, and whether containment vessels have been breached or not, and roofs that have are no longer there because of explosions of hydrogen
What's
gas.
the difference between a meltdown and a partial meltdown, just for lay people?
Well, degree, I would just back it up and say that to answer your question, I think the answer really lies in sort of public education about nuclear energy, and in this crisis, there's been a clamoring for information and often kind of uninformed speculation about what it entails. And one can contrast that to Chernobyl, where there was no information,
right.
And indeed the Chernobyl disaster in Russia, in the then Soviet Union in 1986, ushered in an era of glasnost under Gorbachev. But nuclear reactors, controlled fission, depend upon fuel rods loaded with enriched uranium in thermal light water reactors, and in the process of generating the heat that runs the turbines and generates electricity, the amount of those fuel rods, the fission process kind of degrades their efficiency in producing energy, and when that efficiency level drops to a level where it's no longer economical to run the reactor at that level, they refer to them as being spent fuel rods that are then taken out, put into cooling ponds, and a fresh load is put in. Under the current system, common practice in Western countries, the fuel rods are stored on site or near site. And that is
the spent fuel rods.
The spent fuel rods in close proximity to the working reactors. And this raises the question, which is a huge public policy question in this country and others, is management of the nuclear fuel cycle from cradle to grave. And what will be the disposition of fissionable materials after their productive life in reactors? There's a presidential commission in this country that is studying the issue and will report out. It's very politicized because of the so-called NIMBY, not in my backyard issue in terms of storage.
How
the
long
Royal
do
Society,
those materials need to be stored?
long term, because some of the products like cesium...
Decades?
Longer than decades, into thousands of years.
Thousands of years.
Okay. And so the disposition, it's a technical issue, but also a political issue. And there had been a proposal to have the material stored at Yucca Mountain in this country, and there were questions about whether that site is geologically stable for 10,000 years or 100,000 years. You get a sense of what the time frames are. But the interim storage proposals that are being examined would buy us, so to speak, 50 to 100 years, which is pretty good.
So we figure out some other technology?
Well,
or some
yes.
other...
I mean, it will emerge. They put it into casks from the cooling ponds into dry storage, and hope to have it in a stable condition to last, decades. But nuclear has the connotation that comes from mushroom clouds and lack of public information, and of course it's acute in a time of crisis with reason. But I would go back to the point I made earlier, which is that all of these energy choices carry risks of some kind or another, and the climate change issue is there, and the amount of carbon that Western and now increasingly Eastern societies are pumping in the atmosphere, that if China and India don't go nuclear or some alternative, low carbon alternative, they will either use gas and oil or coal, which is plentiful in their societies, which Bob Hathaway could comment on.
No easy way out here.
Yeah.
Bob, I've been leaning heavily on Rob for some of the technical questions, so I'll bounce around a bit, because one thing I want to ask you about, you talked about the U.S. reaction. What about the reaction of the Prime Minister and the Emperor and those types of political calculations when public statements are made in times of crisis? How does that differ from our expectations here? Often here, even anti-government people will suddenly be glued to their TV sets and want to hear what the president has to say. Are expectations similar in Japan?
Well, yes and no. The Emperor has in recent days made 2 public appearances.
Which are very rare.
Very rare. If President of the United States essentially stayed within his living quarters for the first 3 weeks of the crisis and only made 2 public appearances, people in this country said, where is he? But the Japanese people recognized that it was actually quite extraordinary for the Emperor to make a televised address on this crisis. And then just yesterday, he and the Empress visited one of the shelters for the families who had been displaced by the catastrophe. This was rightly regarded as indicating how significant a crisis it was, and it points out sort of the differences in our two political systems. If I can just say one or two other things about the Japanese response. We haven't mentioned, but we clearly should mention, the heroism of the emergency responders, including many who are still on the job at great personal risk. One of the other things that has struck me is how fully the Japanese military, called the Self-Defense Forces, have been involved in responding to the emergency in a country which ever since 1945 has been historically very, very suspicious of the Japanese military. And just in recent weeks has been widespread public appreciation for and admiration of the role played by the Japanese military. And we may be seeing, this is just one element of it, because this has been a process which is going on for some time now, but we may be seeing a gradual shift in Japanese society about the military, about the use of force under certain circumstances in international affairs. Some people have talked about Japan gradually becoming a, quote, more normal country, that is, being prepared to exercise all the leverages and tools of power that any great nation uses, including, from time to time, military force, a route which Japan has really shied away from ever since 1945.
You're describing the end of World War II hangover, essentially.
Well, it's an end which has been ongoing for several decades now, and this isn't the end of the debate. But I think the events of the last 3 weeks have simply contributed to what has already been going forward in Japan.
Nobuo, could you comment on the response of the international community and the help that Japan has received?
Well, actually, many countries have sent in, rescue missions, relief missions, particularly from, of course, from the United States and our neighbors too. And sometimes they difficult neighbors. We for the first time have received rescues from China and South Korea. That's not what took place in 1995 when the western city of Kobe was struck by the magnitude 7.3 earthquake. And
has TEPCO received assistance in dealing with the nuclear issue from
well,
outside the country?
actually, yes. The government has been asking for an assistance and advice from the U.S. specialists and regulators in putting down fire.
What, Rob, you previewed the debate over nuclear power. What do you see as happening in the immediate debate? Is this put a freeze on it? Will this be politically untouchable for a while? The nuclear energy question.
Yeah, I think that in part it depends on how the Japan crisis plays out and whether there's a major release of radioactive material comparable to 3 Mile Island, say. Probably, and there's been polling already about kind of a dip in support for nuclear energy in this country. And I don't know, but I imagine it was the same after the BP oil blowout decline in support for offshore drilling, that there will be a period in which kind of nuclear will recede in sort of public prominence until the current crisis is sort of played out and there's some judgment about its long-term implications. But even if there's a hiatus in support for nuclear energy, I think it has to remain on the table because really there's no alternative for low carbon output. And I think the question is going to be increasingly framed not what kind of nuclear renaissance, but how can that be conducted, taking into account of the Japanese nuclear crisis, which underscored that this is complex technology that requires high level of education, safety standards. I mean, the Japanese really met all these criteria. There's the question about older facilities that need to be upgraded, and upgrading designs of reactors. Again, I would cite the two key countries in terms of getting some leverage on carbon are China and India. And if they don't have a nuclear future, and their politics, I guess, are each context specific, but are different than the politics in the United States, if they don't embrace a nuclear future, their future will be probably one dominated by coal.
John, if I can simply follow up, particularly on China. China at this moment has 13 nuclear reactors for producing power. They've got 40 more on the books, either under construction or planning. China may also pause slightly, but China's going forward. This seems to me to raise a question for the entire international community. Do we want China to be the rule maker? Can China, rather than other governments more responsive to public will, be responsible for enforcing regulations, for oversight, for safety issues, for enforcing building codes? I think this has got to be part of the discussion.
Gentlemen, this has gone way too quickly considering the enormity of the issues on the table, but thank you for helping shed some light on it, and perhaps as things clear up we can come back together and take a look at it when we have a little more perspective. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.
Next week on Dialogue.
I think probably more than economists will. And I'll say that in the last couple of years, it was doom and gloom. And without a doubt, it looked like we could fall off a cliff. And, extraordinary things were done by the United States government and the Treasury stepping forward, the Federal Reserve Bank, et cetera, to stave off that kind of nightmare scenario. I think for the first time, it's looking pretty stable and much more optimistic.